In this first unit, we're looking at reform. Religious reform is what we're covering today, but there is also reform in education and in social issues, most importantly, that dealing with abolitionism and women's rights. And we will take time to do both of those. Tomorrow, you get a double dose. Even though you're going to the museum, we'll be together tomorrow afternoon as well. And we'll be looking at a founding document of women's rights, the Declaration of Sentiments, okay? This lesson is about religious reforms. Alexis de Tocqueville, okay? Did we have an Alexis Tocqueville in Meeting of the Minds in this class? Alexis Tocqueville was what I want to refer to as an early sociologist. He took several years, came to the United States, and looked at American society as a unique cultural phenomenon. Where was he from? Where was Alexis Tocqueville from? France. Okay? So what he really liked about the United States was the fact that we are this egalitarian, democratic society. People seem to not have that much differences between one another. Yeah, you have to overlook the slavery thing. Yeah, you got to overlook the women's rights thing. But white men, by and large, seem to be relatively equal. Okay, they address each other as Mr. and not titles of nobility or anything like that. One of the elements of American equality he looks at is religious equality and the influence of American religion. And here's my question to you. Does the Christian religion still have influence in American government today, American politics?
Yes.
Okay, Tocqueville said that in no country in the world is the Christian religion more influential than it is in America. Give me some examples that would say he's right, that we haven't changed that much, that the Christian religion is still excessively influential in American government. Yeah.
Some voters, when they look for a candidate, they look to see if they're Christian or not and vote for them if they are.
Yeah, a lot of voters care about the religious viewpoints of a candidate. We have yet to have a candidate that is vocally identified as an atheist. Now, people will assume Thomas Jefferson's an atheist. There are people that said Bernie Sanders is not really that religious, but every American political leader has had to acknowledge some kind of faith in a higher power, all right? It would be disastrous politically in America to acknowledge, oh, I'm an atheist, God is not real. That would not fly in American politics today. Yes?
Would being in God we trust on our bills?
Certainly, yeah. There are still plenty of symbols of a higher power or America's connection to religion in our slogans like "In God We Trust." The other thing is, at least the conservative party of the United States has very strong ties to traditional conservative Christianity. Evangelical Christians vote, overwhelmingly vote. And they are very concerned about issues like pro-life, right? The traditional family unit, and they want to make sure that their candidates reflect those same values. So even if your presidential candidate is a billionaire on his fourth wife that used to own a beauty pageant, people want to know that he is going to kiss the ring of Christianity and say that, you know, he's pro-life or that he reads the Bible or something like that. Remember the whole Trump thing over 2 Corinthians? You remember how President Trump was quoting his favorite Bible verse and he said 2 Corinthians instead of 2 Corinthians. And people are like, yeah, he's not that religious, but somehow he won the evangelical block. So it does show the fact that religion is still very powerful in American politics. Okay? This particular time period, so the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian republics, we are starting to see major change in American churches. Still, 75% of Americans are attending church regularly, and it's not the kind of church the Pilgrims went to. What do you remember about the Pilgrims and Puritanism? What was the backbone of Puritanism?
Fear.
Fear. Okay? Why? What did they believe above all other things as far as their destiny? Predetermined destiny, predestination, right? Okay, that no matter what you did, God was an angry, vengeful God, that your fate, your eternal fate, was predetermined since the original sin of man, and that if you didn't behave, God would not only get you in the afterlife, but he would get you in this life. So religion was very close and influential in the lives of Puritans. Then we went through this period of time where the age of reason, if you remember Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and John Locke and some of those enlightened thinkers, they start thinking about science and reasoning, and they're not so religious anymore. Okay? We're going to talk about them as well, but here's what I would propose to you. Like a pendulum, America goes back and forth between conservative and liberal movements. Religion is no exception to that. Okay, so after the Puritans, we get this period of time, the Age of Reason, where religion starts to diminish, and we see the churches pick up the First Great Awakening. What's the difference between the church and the First Awakening and, let's say, colonial time? What does the church turn to try to get people back to church? Think about Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Yes?
They started being more more energetic in their
Emotionalism, yeah. And coming back to what Sean said, fear, right? So people were bored by church, so the ministers start shouting and carrying on and being very dramatic, but there's still mostly Puritanism about this idea that God has determined your fate, right? You just better act right. Okay? The Second Great Awakening, which is the time period we're talking about today, is different from that in a number of different ways. So, it's also very different from the Age of Reason. So if it's a liberal movement that people started turning to science and away from God, that led to the First Great Awakening. People eventually kind of come back to their roots, that there are certain things in the world you can't observe through the five senses, but they're felt in the heart. Okay? You guys remember Thomas Paine? He's another one of these enlightened figures. What article did we read by Thomas Paine? What? Common Sense. Okay? He uses scientific reasoning. For example, we know the moon, which is smaller than the earth, revolves around the earth. The earth is smaller than the moon, or smaller than the sun. It revolves around the sun. How is it that Great Britain, which is small, controls North America, which is big? He says that doesn't make common sense. Well, Thomas Paine is also a big critic of religion. And for those of you that aren't especially religious, Thomas Paine shares some of the same criticisms of the church that are still around today. This idea that the church is all about fear, that the church is about controlling people politically and making money to basically benefit the church, right? You go in on Sunday, they shove an offering plate in your face. You go on Sunday, and if you didn't vote the way the minister voted, they tell you you're going to go to hell. That bothered Thomas Paine and enlightened thinkers. Okay, some of our greatest leaders during this time, so prior to the Second Great Awakening, people like Thomas Jefferson were not especially religious. Okay, they claimed a faith in a higher power, but they were what we would call deists. Anybody wearing a watch today? Okay, let's see your watch. Okay, you've got that smartwatch thing going on, right? Do the creators of that watch ever come and visit you?
No.
So they don't ever come and reset it for you or check on how their creation is doing?
I had to go
Like,
customer service.
Ding dong. Hi. We just wanted to make sure the watch we created is in good shape. We've created a universe of watches, but how's that one watch we sold you going? Nobody does that, right? Okay. But you know there's somebody that made that watch, right? Because that watch didn't just come out of nowhere. It didn't just happen that a cloud of dust ignited and formed this intricate, sophisticated watch. Something created that with intention. This is what deists like Thomas Jefferson believed. that the universe was like a watch. It proves the fact that there is a watchmaker. It proves the fact that there's a creator. You know, this idea of evolution, or the idea that you can take nothing and create that out of nothing comes something just by accident, that isn't what deists believe. They thought, you know, you look at creation, it's very sophisticated, it's rational, there's a hierarchy of things. It can't just be by accident. There has to be a watchmaker. There has to be a creator. But like a watchmaker, God, or the powerful being that created the universe, wound it up, set it on the shelf, and walked away. That's what deists, in a sense, believe. Okay? Because it doesn't make sense to them that a God that's all powerful, all knowing, all good, would be living side by side with the people in the way that the Puritans believed. Okay? So let me give you a philosophical question. I want you to answer this, because this is where people in the Second Enlightenment were frustrated by deism. Okay? Well, if God isn't keeping score, right, how can God be all powerful, all good, and all knowing, and yet bad things happen?
Can you say that? I'm sorry.
Okay?
I understand.
So the Puritans were used to being told, well, good things happen when you're good, bad things happen when you're bad, but you have no control over your own destiny, right? Deists are saying, well, you know, God isn't around. Yeah, he maybe created something, but then he left it alone. Okay? How can you have a God that's all powerful, all knowing, and all good, and yet there's still evil in the world? Because if God was all powerful, wouldn't he take care of all the evil? If God was all knowing, he would already know what actions you're going to do and not do, and would probably prevent them. And if God is all good, right, what kind of God allows people to suffer and allows people to do horrible things to one another? That sounds like, you know, a petty teenager, not an omnipotent God. So what's your answer? Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking that's actually one of the questions like I was like, why does all this bad stuff happen? I mean,
Right.
but I mean, at least what I think. So when bad people do bad things, I'm thinking that's free will. I mean, obviously God doesn't want that to happen, but he, like the Bible says, God gives free will. So.
If God doesn't, and just to play the devil's advocate, if God doesn't want bad things to happen, he either doesn't stop it or he can't stop it. And if he doesn't stop it, then he's not all good. And if he can't stop it, he's not all powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. Last time I checked, I'm not Jesus. I'm not
sure. No, it's. But you brought up something that's really important. And here's the thing: how many of you think we have free will? Okay, are we rats in a maze? Are we rats in a maze, like Smashing Pumpkins? Despite all our rage, are we still just a rat in a cage? Or do we have free will? Okay. What? Nick, you don't think we have free will?
I'm jamming after that song.
Oh, yeah. It's a good song. Here's the thing. Part of the Second Enlightenment is this developing sense that the universe is rational, and it's knowable, it's fixable, that a lot of our problems are based on our own decisions, but that God has given humans free will. And so, number one, your actions you take can save you, or they can condemn you. Okay? Deists, this is a little bit more on deists here. But this is really moving away from Calvinism. It's moving away from deism, and it's giving this friendly Father-like God. Listen, as you get around for the holidays, if you're around people that are praying and they talk about God the Father, like a parental figure that is caring and concerned about humanity, this is a byproduct of the Second Enlightenment. This idea that God isn't a big bully with a hammer waiting to hit you over the head, but that God wants you to choose his side, right? And if you choose his side, you'll be rewarded. If you don't choose his side, you'll be in big trouble. Okay? Free will and the possibility of salvation through good works. Not a stern creator, but a loving Father. Questions about that at all? Yeah.
Well, one thing I just thought of that comes to mind with like the father thing. Sometimes, when a kid asks to do something, sometimes the parents are like, well, you do it, you'll know from your mistakes. I feel like that's kind of what is going on.
Okay.
What they believe. And God knows what's going to turn out. But
is it possible that your viewpoints have been shaped by the theology that the churches and institutions you've been exposed to believe? Right?
Probably.
Okay. For example, Catholicism would shape a person one way, and Methodism, growing up in the Methodist church, the main thing with that was that basically God is good with who you are and just wants a relationship and doesn't care so much about your sins, but just wants some kind of relationship, where Baptists believe that people got to get right with God because he's coming back and he's waiting for it, but the end of the times is coming, and so you better set things straight. How you've been raised and what you've been exposed to might shape your viewpoint on this particular matter. Okay? Anyway, this time period is referred to as the Second Great Awakening. Okay? Like the First Great Awakening, it's rich with emotionalism. I'm going to show you a picture here of a Methodist revival. Anybody watch the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Yes.
Yes.
Don't you love that?
That's a great
It's such good music. And the Man of Constant Sorrow, but you know how they go down to the river and pray, and they're holding the Baptist revival, and they're praying away the demons, and people are rolling on the ground and dancing and singing up, shouting up hallelujahs. That emotionalism comes from these revivals. The Methodists and the Baptists, a couple of things. Number one, stress a personal relationship. Okay? They're highly emotional. But the other thing I want to point out is this, because this is going to take us into the women's rights movement, is that they're also very democratic. And what I mean by that is they allow the members of the church, not just the priest, not just the pastor, but the members of the church, to have a say in how the church functions and also a voice in public. Now, this is revolutionary for women. Here's why. Okay, do you remember back to the Puritans? There was a woman who tried to preach in public, and she was kicked out of the city. Who was that? Anne Hutchinson. Okay? Women's voices were virtually silenced in public affairs and in most church affairs as well. It's during the 19th century, because of the democratic nature of these churches, all members, including women, begin to have a voice not only in church affairs, but they're able to vocalize what their concerns are about the safety, security, not only of their souls, but of their communities. Okay? Now, we've also talked about the cult of domesticity, right? Women were expected to be the moral background of their families. They became the moral background of their churches. And because of the public atmosphere of church, women became the moral background of social issues. So whether it was prison reform like Dorothea Dix, temperance, okay, some of the temperance reformers, the women's rights movement, which we'll be dealing with more on Wednesday, or abolition, women led those movements because they used their voice in public to try to raise awareness of these social issues and to bring about change. Okay? And we'll be getting deeper into that in a little bit. Take a look at this image of a Methodist revival. Okay? A lot of times we think about people of history being much more uptight, stuffy, conservative, hard to relate to. If you look at this picture, I think this is a scene that a lot of us would be a little nervous to partake in. They're dancing in their underwear. Okay? Literally, you can see the women have stripped down to their, what is that called? The knickers or the what's the well, it's almost like their undergarments. Their undergarments. They're rolling around in the dirt. This lady's passing out. They're dancing. They're throwing up their hands. A lot of us would be uncomfortable being that close with our churches or any other group of strangers. Okay, read about the Oneidas. You guys, for those of you that looked in your textbooks, there were religious groups like the Oneidas that were centered around complicated, I'm using air quotes, complex marriages, which is no marriage but open relationships with members of the community, free love, and the idea that through the expression of free love, you get into a heightened religious state. I mean, that is really out there. The Mormons practice polygamy, and people are going to condemn them for it, but these are values that today, I mean, would still make a pretty conservative person blush, right? So there are elements here that have overlap. Anyway, you can see here people dancing, speaking in tongues, passing out. Hopefully at the end of this, they'll go down to the river and do full body immersion, baptism, that kind of thing. It was a wild time. People that were most likely to participate in this came from the middle and lower classes. Why is it that we rarely see the well-to-do involved in social movements?
They have better things.
Okay, they have better things to do with their time, maybe.
Because they felt life was already good.
Right.
They didn't need to change.
Right? People that are doing well tend to feel like there's no need to change. They like how things are. On the other hand, people that don't have power and groups that do not have economic status tend to latch onto new movements. Notice this. The biggest participants in the Second Great Awakening, in the creation of these churches, are middle-class women. People who are literate, they know how to read, but they've been silenced their whole lives by their husbands or their fathers or their churches. And so women are becoming the most ardent members of the church community, the most vocal, the most active members of social groups. Okay? So they get their foot in the door through the church, and this is going to lead to more political action by them as well. Simple things like bringing their families and their husbands back to God through church services, to encouraging their family to be a dry family or to refrain from drinking alcohol, all the way up to joining social groups that service the needy, to spearheading major social reforms like abolitionism and women's rights. The whole Seneca Falls Convention, which we're going to be talking about Wednesday, came after the fact that some American women went to the International Abolition Fair in Europe and were not allowed to speak publicly because they were women. So they set up the Seneca Falls Convention to be a rally for women about women's rights to speak and to participate in the political process. We're going to get Susan B. Anthony and her Declaration of Sentiments, which is tailored to the Declaration of Independence. And we're going to get speeches like Ain't I a Woman? And we'll look at all of those through the week here. But being able to speak publicly, that probably comes as a surprise to even the girls in this room, because today you're less likely to be silenced just simply because of your gender. Although, let me ask you this. When a woman expresses her viewpoint, is it received differently than when a man expresses his viewpoint?
They don't tell them to sit.
Yeah. Okay. All of this religious fervor, this is what I want to say about this slide. All this religious fervor, you remember the hellfire and brimstone of Jonathan Edwards in the first Great Awakening? All the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening begins in the West. All right. The further east you are, the further to the establishment, especially New England establishment, the more conservative things are. But in the West, anything goes. And in Western New York, there are so many of these revivals going on. They call it the burned over district because it was burning with God's hellfire. All right. One of the groups that pops up in this particular region are the Mormons. The Mormons, though, don't fit the typical mold. They're going to be chased from Western New York down to Missouri, up to Indiana, over to Illinois, before they eventually find sanctuary out in Utah. Here's what I want to point out on this slide as well. All the division of the churches foreshadow the division of our nation. This idea that you can custom blend God or you can custom blend religion, that you don't have to be a part of the establishment, you can create a new tradition, allows people to detach from that tradition and create subgroups. So the churches will split. For example, the Methodists will split over slavery. The Baptists will split over slavery. The Lutherans, anybody here Lutheran? Right? You got the ELC, the Evangelical Lutheran Church. You've got the Missouri Synod Lutherans. They start to break up over sectional interests. That's foreshadowing the split of the Union Civil War. The Mormons, in many ways, like other Christian groups, wanted to have an outlet for their views. Joseph Smith, the founding member and the prophet of the Mormon Church, receives golden plates with a message from God that he deciphers to be the Book of Mormon, telling about how Jesus came back in North America and the story of this New World Jesus in what is considered an extension of the New Testament. Okay, so Smith's followers not only caused controversy or were tied to controversy because here we have this whole new chapter to the New Testament professing that Jesus was in the United States, but the fact that their culture was very different from what was typical in the West. Westerners tended to be independent. The Mormons, though, were communal, to say the least, communist in some cases, to be more extreme, in the sense that these groups lived as a community. They didn't own private property. They shared everything, and they voted and they acted as a unit. So oftentimes they voted as a block, and so their influence in state politics was felt. Because of their harassment, they started openly drilling as a militia, which made them seem like they were preparing for some kind of cataclysmic takeover or civil war. But the thing that people got hyper-focused on was the fact that their founders were practitioners of polygamy. Okay, they had multiple wives. So Joseph Smith had 7, and Brigham Young, the second leader of the Mormon Church, had something like 28 and over 50 some children. Okay. Now, conservatives would say, especially northern conservatives would say that polygamy and slavery were the two social blights, the two evils of America that were going to lead to the downfall of the country. I have yet to see a really good argument against polygamy in the sense of, other than it being very different, why people were so bent out of shape about it, just being sinful, I guess. But you have to remember, groups like the Oneidas were practicing free love, and people weren't too terribly bothered by that. So it just was a matter of us versus them sort of mentality. In 1844, Joseph Smith was murdered with his brother. Brigham Young took over, and to escape the persecution that was taking place in the old Northwest Territory, Brigham Young leads the Mormons all the way to the Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake in present-day Utah. For those of you guys who have been downtown and seen the Mormon Trail statue, do you know what I'm talking about? It's got the ox, and it has the ox-drawn wagons. They're bogged down in the mud, and they're pushing on westward. Do you know what I'm talking about? A big bronze statue downtown. Looks like this. You know, you've got the ox pushing through the snow. That's because the Mormons in the winter of 44 stopped in Council Bluffs as their winter quarters. So if you're driving out to the airport, you see the Mormon Bridge, and there's the Mormon Trail Park. The Mormon Trail is going to become a tried and tested pathway out to the west. So a lot of people moving west, especially during the Oregon Trail days and the California Gold Rush, are going to follow the Mormon Trail westward to Salt Lake City before going on to California or Oregon. But that monument downtown is not just for Western expansion, but it is in dedication to the Mormons that stayed in the Omaha area in the winter of 44. Last slide. When they got out to Utah, they had this terrible plague of locusts, and a flock of seagulls descended and consumed the locusts. And you guys probably can see how this would be interpreted as a biblical prophecy or message from God. You think about the Old Testament and Moses and the plagues on Egypt. In this case, though, the Mormons took this incident with the locusts and seagulls as a sign that they should settle in Salt Lake, that would become their new oasis in the desert, away from persecution in America. Now, at the time, Salt Lake was part of Mexico. But after the Mexican-American War ends, it's part of the United States, but it's far enough out there that they have a little bit of peace. Although Brigham Young is going to become the governor of Utah, and he's going to have a military standoff with the U.S. government before all is said and done. Questions, comments?
Do you need the
What?
Go ahead and you're doing the track with it. I had to find something for the